Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Gio and Joey Show with a special guest today. Joey, introduce our guest and let the audience know what we're going to talk about.
So our guest is Jeff Mayhugh. And the audience may be sensing a pattern with this one, but he's another friend I got to know kind of from the Reagan underground circles on X. But he's a contributor for The Hill, a regular contributor over at The Hill. And he's been seen on the Timcast podcast, on Matt Lewis's show, where we both wrote for a while at the Freeman Foundation. So how you doing today, Jeff?
I'm good, man. Thanks for having me on the show.
So, Joey?
So the reason I wanted to have Jeff on is because, and we were kind of just talking about this backstage a little bit, but there's not a whole lot of people in today's politics who think about politics at the level of the American founders, right? Like when you read the Federalist Papers, right? Or even the Anti-Federalist Papers and their arguments between each other. These guys, the founding generation, were thinking about politics at like a deep level. And I think with what we're going to talk about today, with Jeff's ideas for reforming the House of Representatives, he's thinking about politics on that level. So I was just very interested in having this conversation, and thank you for coming on.
I'm excited to talk about representation.
All right, brother. So let me kick it off. So what got you down this rabbit hole? There's so many rabbit holes in politics. What got you down this particular, and why are you so passionate about it?
Man, that's a good question. I guess you don't really know why you get into any rabbit hole, right? You just kind of find yourself there one day and you just hope to get out. No, after COVID or during COVID, I got really into reading. I didn't really read a lot younger. This kind of like flowed for like just a transformation as me as a person. I got married young, divorced, had kids. I was a stepfather, kind of struggling with life. I kind of reprioritized things, decided to focus on educating myself, started going to church. And this COVID period was a time where I had time, like actual time to like read. And I started studying. I love people. I love history. My grandfather loves history. And I started reading biographies of presidents. I read the like Chernow Washington biography. I read the McCullough, John Adams, the Meacham, Jefferson, and I just started going down the row reading all this stuff. And somewhere along the way, I realized that we don't talk about representation at all in American politics, and they talked about it a lot. And that seemed a little off. And then I learned, as I progressed, I just kept on reading through history, right? And I get to the progressive era, and I learned that we capped our House at 435. So up until that point, as the population grew, we got more representation. And, there were so many battles that happened in this. And then I was like, I think this is our problem. Like if you read about the founders and you think, okay, what were they fighting against? Were they fighting against the king? They were fighting against Parliament? They were fighting for a say in the rules. Mm-hmm. Okay, they were fighting for representation. Our battle cry was no taxation without representation. And everybody complains about their taxes and nobody complains about their representation. And the reality is, if you had better representation, your taxes wouldn't be so high. And so like when I put all this stuff together, I was like, somebody's got to talk about it. Nobody's talking about it. I'm going to start talking about it. I don't know how I'm going to talk about it. I don't know what I'm going to do. I started learning how to, I told you backstage, I had to learn how to write. Like I read the Federalist Papers. I read about representation. I realized if you're going to have an idea, you got to be able to defend it. And so I just kind of, and here I am, 4 years later or whatever it is. And people are asking me about representation, and that's good. I'm happy.
That's good. So you said something about the fact that it's capped at 435. Considering our population increase, what do you think it should be?
So that is an interesting question, and I've proposed different numbers throughout my journey here. And I think ultimately I won't settle on a number until I get to debate it with a whole bunch of other really smart people. And I look forward to that day, to be honest with you. Right now, I think I proposed last week, I wrote an article on my Substack. and it was 1350, I think was the number I put on there. And I came up with this number because it divided, first of all, I divided the house into 3 chambers, okay? An eastern chamber, a central chamber, and a western chamber. And this decentralizes power on many different levels, okay? Because now the press that all convenes about Washington, D.C. can't just be in D.C. Now they have to be in Texas and California, right? If those are the states that get the capitals, who knows, right? So you decentralize the press power. All the lobbyists that centralize around there, well, now they have to be
Spread
in 2
out.
different chambers too, right? And so as I lost my train of thought real quick. Hold on. What were we talking about?
About why you arrive at that number. Why more than 435?
So the other thing that in my study of, I want to decentralize the power, but the other thing that I've come to realize about Congress, and to be fair, is we're very critical of them not doing a good job, but their job is very, 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 very difficult. Okay. Because they represent so many people, they have so many responsibilities, and they have so many employees, so many different branches to oversee. They're too small a body. Okay. And so when I was thinking about how many people do you actually need to do that job, I was reading the book Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. I think he's a Harvard professor somewhere, and he was talking about how part of the humans, what makes us special is our ability to communicate, our ability to write, our ability to stack knowledge on top of knowledge and learn things from the past, right? But as individuals, we struggle with the amount of relationships that we can have. So there's this, there was a study called by this guy Dunbar in Britain in the 90s. And he's got this thing called Dunbar's number. And it basically says that a human is limited to about 150 relationships, okay? That they have regular relationships. So I thought about that on a level of all right, you have to be able to deal with more than 100. If you have to deal with more than 150 people in your day-to-day job, then your job is too hard. And I thought about that on a congressional rep, between all of the different other reps that they would have to meet with, the people that they would have to oversee, their staff, their constituents. And I go, there's just way too many people they have to see. So I need to come up with a number that makes it feasible where they can be underneath that 150 threshold, right? And corporations use this theory all the time in their management structures, right? Like Amazon's really famous for the fact that if there's too many people in a group where somebody doesn't feel heard, they need another manager, right? You got to be able to help your employees grow. You got to be able to communicate with them and have open communication. That's kind of how the representative should be, right? You need open communication with your constituents. You need to be able to have the capacity to have the conversations with people. And I think that they're just overworked. So I wanted to come up with a number that broke that down. And by dividing the chambers, each chamber is under 435, okay? If you have that number, which means that, and then they each have a different speaker. They don't have to interact as much with each other. They have limited, they're more focused on their committees and stuff. And it's just making the numbers smaller. My thing is, anytime the group gets too big, it's going to divide whether you want it to divide or not. You should be ahead of the curve and making the group smaller so they're more manageable.
Well, you mentioned, let me jump one last question just on this train of thought, Joey. So you mentioned, initially 1350, but you said you'd love to talk to other people. What other numbers have you heard in your theory, in your line of thinking?
I mean, there's lots of different, there's the Cube Butte rule. There's, I think the American Enterprise Institute in conjunction with something else, they put out a number. I was like 600 something. I apologize. Can't remember all the different numbers off the top of my head, but there's lots of other numbers out there. They're all linked. The studies are linked on the No Cap Fund website, which I'm vice president of, nocapfund.org or y435.com. And you can click on those links and find those articles there at different numbers. I've proposed one at 870. And my mindset behind that number that I proposed was it just made it easy, right? It was easy to explain to people. We're just going to double the house, right? And my argument is there's too much work, not enough people. We need to hire more employees. Let's double the house. Let's double our workforce in American representation. And we'll go from 435 to 870, divide all the districts in two. and it was just a simple plan, right? As I'm trying to explain it to people. But at the end of the day, I think there's a lot of different factors that need to go into this. And like I said, I want like an Edison workshop, like Edison as an inventor. He had like a team of other inventors that were tinkering with him. Like I want to be in that room, like.
So obviously you were saying, right, obviously this came out of the progressive era, and I kind of consider myself somewhat of an anti-Wilson. So generally speaking, I'm suspicious of anything that came out of that era. But what was the reason given at the time for capping the House at 435?
So I am not a fan of a lot of the changes they made during the progressive era. However, this had nothing to do with Woodrow Wilson. And it really had nothing to do with the progressive era. This was a problem that had stemmed all the way through the Gilded Age in the 1870s. Congress had been at each other's throats since the Civil War, okay? The Republicans dominated the House. They did it through, at some points, corrupt measures with, oh man, what was his, with the, I can't think of the guy's name right now. With James Garfield was president, and Chester A. Arthur, and the Merchant House guy, I can't remember. I'm sorry, I'm spacing on his name. Anyways, so they had been in each other's throat. Congress was fighting. The country was growing rapidly, right? Tons of people were coming into the country. Immigrants were coming in. Large cities were being built by corporations, and lots of things were happening. And as this happened, they struggled to continue to apportion representation. And then as things changed, the population moved from rural to urban. Right. And as it moved from rural to urban, it made it even harder, because now as you reapportion representation, people that had jobs in Congress for a really long period of time were going to lose their districts. And so states that were poised to lose these districts didn't want to, continue to apportion, expand representation, because they lost in their district. Right. And so there was this fight over it. There were lots of different variables that went into it. But it stemmed, like I said, from, I would say, like the 1870s or 1880s all the way through. Part of a real famous congressperson, Speaker of the House, was Thomas Reed, and he was Speaker in the 1890s. And he came up with something called Reed's Rules. And part of the reason that he came up with the Reed's Rules is because the Democrats were using disappearing quorum to fight legislation, right? Congress, again, they were just at each other's throats. And a lot of people thought that this was because they were too large of a body. The reality was they were just very partisan, still fighting over from the Civil War. It's always been like that. We've always been fighting each other. And generation after generation, right? 10 years, you kind of have this friction, this issue of it not happening, and Congress not being able to do their job effectively. Power is centralized in different ways. And it just came to a point where it came to a stalemate. They just didn't do it one year. And they argued about it for 10 years. So after the last time they had apportioned the House was 1911, after the 1910 census. And then in 1920, after the census, because this had gotten to the point where now it was the first time where the population was more urban than rural. And it had been slowly moving this way for a long period of time. And it's the first time that it flipped was after the 1920 census. And you had this fight for 10 years. Should we continue to apportion the House? What should the number be? What are we supposed to do? What's our responsibility? And there were lots of different arguments that happened during this time period. And the reality is they just gave up. They just said, all right, we're going to keep it as it is. Another thing that they fought about was who should be counted, right? Because immigration was huge during this period of time. There were so many non-Americans that were counted and apportioned for the House. So in theory, if you are let's say you're J.P. Morgan or Alexander Vanderbilt or Hershey or whoever. Hershey's actually a good example. If you take Hershey, because he built this he built his own town, right, around Hershey chocolate, right? So he pays all the people in town, so realistically, they're going to vote for whoever he wants them to vote for, right? And let's say he wants more control in Congress. Let's say a corporation CEO like J.P. Morgan wanted a lot of control in Congress. Well, he could, in theory, go buy different manufacturing facilities build towns around those facilities, import immigrants to those facilities who cannot vote because they're not citizens, but get counted for apportionment. So now you have this area with lots of people who are not American citizens who are counted as for representation, and now they get allotted a congressional rep, and that congressional rep is kind of owes their job to JP Morgan in theory. So now like he's able to control them. And this idea of, okay, who should we count? Should we count American citizens or all people? It was kind of muddied because of the way that, the original Constitution was written around slavery, how the 13th, 14th Amendment kind of, rewrote the rules on how we counted. It's it was said all persons. It didn't say citizens, it said all persons. And immigration wasn't the same way that it is now. It wasn't the same way that it is then. And our founders didn't think about this possibility of being able to like just completely shift political representation by moving large amounts of people into a new district, right? And so ultimately they decided against this. They left it at all persons, okay? They wrote it into the cap. So now when you do the census, it's all people of the United States. And so that's I think that's a big problem of our immigration system, is that Congress in some ways is incentivized to just not have a solid immigration plan because, as long as they're attracting people to their group and those people end up voting for them when they become citizens, or even if they don't, they could just support them financially or they could support them voluntarily, right? They don't even have to vote to have like power in the system.
Yep.
Right.
So let me jump in here because in what you said here, you brought up a lot of questions to my mind. The first one is, at what point, right? Because you said 1350, a number you threw out there. At what point, though, do you go the opposite end, where you have too much number and you begin to dilute the people's voices, right? Because the more people you have in a committee, man, the longer it takes to get things done.
That's a great question, and it's funny because that's in like that. Madison writes almost that exact same thing. He's like, too small a number and it's going to be corrupt. Too many a number and it's going to be confusing, right? And you're not going to be able to get things done. And I think that's a lot of the problem with a large number like 1350, and that's why again I came up with the dividing them into chambers, right? When you have something big, you make it small and it's more manageable, right? So in theory, it's 1350, but it should operate like they're under 400 for each chamber,
like a third
right?
each, right? Yeah.
And so that's the idea, at least. And I gotta flesh out the idea a little bit.
And that's why we're here just talking about it.
But it is a great question, right? And it is something that I think about a lot. It's like, what is too much? Because I've been there. I did. I own a promotional marketing company with my wife, right? We print T-shirts. I started when I was 19 years old. And nice. I do design. I help the schools with logos and stuff. And I would always tell my wife, before she was working with me, I would come home and I would kind of complain sometimes and be like, I was working with this customer and they decided to bring their whole team on board. And I was like, the moment that the whole team came on board, I knew I was in trouble. Because now I had too many cooks in the kitchen trying to tell me how to design a logo, and they don't know how to design a logo. I know how to design a logo, right? But they think they know. Like, they think they know what they like, but they don't know how it's going to look on the T-shirt. They don't know how to print T-shirts. I know how to print T-shirts, and I know how to design logos. You should take my advice, but you can't say that directly to people. They take offense to that, right? But like in theory, like, and so like I get that. Like, I don't want Congress to be that way either. And I know a lot of people have those issues. I've heard for so many people when they read my my last piece, they were like, I do not want a house over 1,000. And I'm like, I hear you. I'm just trying to get people to talk about it, right? Like I'm just like, we don't have to, like, it doesn't have to be over 1,000, but let's talk about a number.
All right. So you want people to talk about a number. So in your mind, you're fully convinced though that 435 in our current state is too little. Would you say that?
I'm 100% convinced it's too little. Yes.
Okay, good. All right, before we continue with our conversation, let people know where they can find you on Substack.
So I'm at politicsandparenting.com is my Substack. And you can find me at nocapfund.com as well, Y435. gmail.com.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
All right, go ahead, Joey.
Yeah, I was just going to say one of the things that actually kind of I think it bears to this conversation, but the fact that your Substack is politics and parenting, and one of the things that kind of it brings up to me is what Madison talks about is about solving the problem of faction by having more smaller factions that are engaged in politics for a particular reason, and that is one thing over the last several years, I think particularly since COVID and parents kind of got to see behind the scenes in education, parents have started to get involved in politics as like a voting group. And I think that's healthy. What would you say? How would you say for the average person, right? They're not going to run for Congress or whatever. How does your ideas, how can it make government more accessible for their particular, interests as a citizen?
Well, I think more to the point is, how is this, if you want something done, you need to understand how things get done. And in the American Republic, in a representative democracy, things get done through your representative in Congress or through your state representative in the House of Delegates, right? Unless you're like a business person, you're probably staying away from the states. If you're a small business person, you're going to the lower chamber, okay? And parents that are engaged, right? A lot of it centers around education. Well, education's decided by representation, right? A lot of people are, will go after the governor, they'll go after the president, but they need to focus on the representatives, right? They need to learn about this thing, how the body works, who's really in charge, who's supposed to write the laws or not write the laws or whatever's going on. And they need to be engaged in the right area, focus their attention in the right spots, right? If you can press all you want on things, but until you find that weak spot or that spot that you're supposed to be at, where you're allowed to be at, you're not really going to get anything done.
Go ahead, Joey.
One of the things that I was also thinking is you're still talking about it like this would be a set number, or as population grows in the future, right? Would we be talking about increasing it, further as say if Matt Iglesias, I think wrote the book, right? 1 billion Americans or whatever, right? Should America get even bigger, it would continue to grow. And would it continue to divide like these other chambers, or how would that work?
I mean, those are great questions, and I don't have solid answers for them yet. But yes, in theory, yes, it should always continue to grow as the population grows. What it grows at, what ratio it grows at, is something that we need to debate and settle on. And I think it should be changeable, right? I mean, the whole part of the Constitution is like, hey, we have these basic things that we all agree on should happen in our government. And then we're giving you this power. And by you, I mean the future, the power to shape this thing however you see fit going forward, that keeps the union together based on these basic foundation principles. And I think that one of those things was expanding the House. It was written into the Constitution, right? And Madison writes it in the Federalist Papers. This is something that we need to think about from time to time, is the way that he describes it in the Federalist Papers, as representation of what the number is. He doesn't have an answer for it because it's a complicated thing, right? Like, it's just not an easy thing. They took a lot of different aspects into how deciding what the number would be. It's the only time during the Federal Convention where George Washington spoke up, right? He was like the lead guy over it. Very stoic guy, very quiet. He let everybody, he was supposed to be out of it, right? He was just kind of like the overseer. But at this moment, when they were debating on the size of the House, it was supposed to be like 1 in 50,000. And he was like, no, like that's too much. It's too far for these people to get to their representative. It's too hard for them to have actual power. If we're going to come up with this system of government and give the people power, then we actually have to give them power. We have to be able to create a system where they can be, have a conversation with their representative. And so I think that we have to think about that. We have to think about representation in a different way, right? Like, we have to think about the fact that our representative has to be able to have a relationship with the people that want to have a relationship with him in the district. The people that have something serious to say. And there'll still be layers of gates, if you will, to get through to that person, but it'll be easier. And right now it's just really hard. And especially because of how partisan everything is if you're realistically, if you're a Republican and you have a Democratic representative, they're probably not going to be interested in what you would have to say, and vice versa the other way,
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you, from earlier, we were talking about how even early on in our nation, right, the concentration in urban areas, you expand the representation, but they're just going to expand primarily in the urban areas, and they tend to lean one way, one party. How do you control for that?
Well, I would say there are a lot of different factors. One, if you're thinking about representation, you should never think about party, right? Because you've lost the boat right off the bat, right? Because the point of representation is to give power to people, not to power to parties. And parties are going to change. What the parties believe in are going to change, right? We just saw an election where in California, in the bluest districts of California, they broke the Trump they broke the Trump, right? Like out of all the Republicans they could have wrote for, they broke the Trump. Okay. And that tells you where we are going and how things change and can change very rapidly. So when you're thinking about representation, you can't think about the party, because then you get sucked into that, well, my team's going to lose. And the moment you get sucked into that, my team's going to lose, you're not really representing people anymore. You're representing your party. And so we can't think about that in coming to these terms. Having said that, I think you'd be surprised at how... Having said that, let me answer your question now. Having said that, let me answer your question now. I think that you would be very surprised at how balanced it would end up being, right? I've seen computer models that people have posted, Uncapped fans that posted, and it looks to be very balanced, okay? And I think that what happens in these districts and why they're so blue, they have a high concentration of blue, but when you divide those things, when you make them smaller, the blue and the red is going to get diluted, right? And one of those districts might end up blue, but the other one might end up red, right? And I think you'd be surprised how much red is close to blue districts right now. There are subsections like in where I live where it's like hardcore, Trump area around where I live, but we live in a very blue area. I guaranteed if you split my district in half, Loudoun County to Prince William County, right? Prince William County would probably end up red, okay? Loudoun County would end up blue, okay? And you might not see that if you're just looking at the overall thing and saying, hey, that's a deep blue district, Wexton 110, plus 10, plus 15, right? Both of those sides are going blue. It's not really true. It's heavily weighted on one side.
I could see that because, for example, in this election, the South in Texas, an area that for many 40 plus years voted blue actually went red. But when you look at, in smaller detail, more magnified, it was a scattering still of some blue, but overall, because of the size, it went red. So what you're saying is that even though you're dividing it, you might get still red pockets or blue pockets, in what now would go totally blue or totally red.
Well, yes. And I think that what you're going to see over the next 10 years is everything that you think a Republican and Democrat is or isn't is going to change. Okay. I read heavily. I've read The Technological Republic by Alex Karp recently. I read Abundance by Ezra Klein recently. The Conservative Futurist by Jim Pethokoukis. These books are thinking about the future and what we need, right? We need energy. We need immigration problems. We need election solving problems, right? And we need a new group of leaders to shape that way. And I think that if you look, there's not a lot of difference other than economics from the Conservative Futurist and Abundance to me. They both have this optimistic problem solving mentality about what we're going through. And I think that they can inspire a generation of leaders to come up with something new, because this stuff that we're stuck with right now is old and it's dated, and I'm tired of having the same fights. I want to talk about something. Let's decentralize our electric grid to make us more secure with our adversaries and cheaper for us at home and give us more power. Everything should be giving American citizens more power, because the more power you give American citizens, the more power our country has. And I like, not to diverge too much, but that's like my favorite thing about the Second Amendment. People always want to rip the Second Amendment until I bring up the fact and be like, you got to think that a nation that wants to invade us has to come across huge swaths of the ocean, and then they got to show up with people that have had guns their whole lives, right? Where they haven't, right? They were just trained. We've been living with them. We play with them. We hunt with them. We compete with them. Like, they are our things. They're gonna be in every single household. Winning war is about people. It's about strategy, and it's about resources. And we have resources already ready to go. Okay, and like, they will think about that. And so when you give people power, it makes the country stronger. It makes the country more powerful as a whole. And I think books like this, Abundance, The Conservative Futurist, The Technological Republic, they're telling us is China is passing us, okay? Because we're not taking our problems seriously. The people in Congress aren't doing anything about it, and we need new people to think about these problems. We need to think about how we get resources to and decentralize our energy grid. We need to think about solving the immigration problem so we can have a labor consistency to be able to do the manufacturing that we need to do in country and still be the trade dominant country that we have been, right? There's so many things that we need to do that we just aren't doing. And I think that, like I said, these books are great. I think people should read them. I got a little off track there. Sorry.
I hit a nerve. He started preaching.
Sorry.
No, that's good. No. I mean that I'm a preacher. I mean that in a good way. You can see the passion come out that you're thinking this through. Before we go on, you talk about, us having weapons and an army having to think about it. There's a reel that goes around, a black comedian talking about the reason countries don't invade us is because of one reason. We got rednecks. And by the time they invade Florida, they'd be there with NASCARs, pickups, and guns. The Marines will show up and be like, hey, war is over. We got to them. So it's true. And then there's that legendary quote, no one's been able to verify it, as to why Japan never attacked the United States. It's because everybody has weapons. So, it's not verifiable, but that's a legend that goes around. That's why they didn't attack mainland. And it's true. I lived in a neighborhood in Texas. I'm in Oklahoma now. There was a guy there who still has government clearance. He has a room that has weapons that aren't even legal. But so, that whole neighborhood, everybody had at least 4 or 5 guns, if not more. So don't think about it.
And if the feds are watching, Gio's friend here had a boating accident, and those guns are no longer in existence.
The guy has government clearance. They ain't coming after him.
Oh, okay. So on the polarization, as I was reading one of the articles that you had sent me, one of the things that I was thinking about that kind of goes to Gio's question, I'd like to get your thoughts on this, is how having these regional, like the House broken up into these regional parts, right? One of the things that's kind of changed about our politics recently is that we've become so polarized, red and blue, where it's like the opposite versus, 30 plus years ago, right? It would have been common to have, say, pro-choice Republicans in California and pro-life Democrats in Texas or whatever, like by region. Or I think of just the fact that, in Louisiana, where they have a pretty good, like a robust life culture, there's actually quite a few elected, like at least in state politics, Democrats or pro-life, and yet they don't make it to the national level because we're so polarized by party. Would kind of one of the effects potentially of this rejiggering of the House be to make it where you could have kind of that that lack of like party polarization in that way? We'd have, more conservative Democrats or more maybe liberal Republicans in certain areas.
So, one, expanding the number immediately does that, because now you create space for other ideas, right? You're not going to be able to control 1,000 representatives, the way you can control 435 or realistically 218, because the party's the one that controls. So you have two parties trying to control, right? Or and control's like the negative word, but the reality is they're dictating the message. Everybody's got to get on brand. Everybody's got to fall in line and vote, right? They got to whip the vote. So by creating a larger number, it's going to be harder to whip that vote. You're going to get people that they're going to win districts because they're smaller, and you're not going to be able to get them in line. They're going to be able to think freely. I think you have an opportunity for a new party to exist within a larger house. I think it's the only way you get a new party, right? Because again, the parties aren't going to give up their power. You have to create new power for yourself. And so that expanding the number makes that happen. Secondarily, the idea with the different chambers is there's many different reasons for it. As I mentioned before, the number of people, it's an organizing of the body. It's an organizing of the structure. By making it smaller, it's just about the people that are there, making them be able to function efficiently without it getting too confusing, being all in the same place. Also, and part of my plan was you have to serve in each one of these chambers. Like you move, right? And part of that is to remind them that they serve the whole country, not just their place in DC, right? Or their constituency. And then also make them see the country and to see the other people and to get to know them, right? Because I think that this is important, when you think about, like I worked part-time at Home Depot recently, and I worked in customer service. And the reality is when you work in customer service, your job is threefold. You represent yourself. You're there for a paycheck, right? You represent the business that's paying you, and then you represent the customer. You have this duality that you have to do, right? And a lot of that goes with the way you do it best is by giving the customer the information they need to make a good decision for them, right? While enforcing all the rules of the business so the business doesn't get taken care of, right? Because when you work customer service at Home Depot, I don't know if you know this, but a whole bunch of people try to rip that company off all the time.
Yeah.
And you got to be on guard for the people trying to you got to be on guard. And then there's a whole bunch of people that just don't know how to use the rules, right? And they're trying to return something. They don't understand how to return it. And all you got to do is explain to them how to do it so they can get what they want, because Home Depot is happy to help them, but they have to follow the rules to do it because we put these rules in place to stop people from scamming us, right? And all you got to do is go through the checks and balances and you get it, right? And I think that our representatives have lost that. They've lost sight of that. And so by breaking them up, making the groups smaller, moving them around the country, making sure that they get to know the people, right? Because that's the thing is when you're working customer service, when you get to know the customers, you start to see them on a regular basis, it's just easier because now they know the rules because you've already told them and they've learned them little by little instead of having to learn them all at once. And sometimes they just learn them by watching because they're around, right? And it just makes life easier. And I think that that's ultimately what would happen if you made the group smaller.
So going back to, increasing the reps, do you think that's why we're in the predicament now where, the phrase that Elon uses that we've been run by bureaucrats, right? You have all these, it seems like Congress has abdicated their responsibility and you have all these bureaus. By increasing the number, can we then naturally shut down all these regulations and bureaus that aren't, people are complaining about Musk. He wasn't voted for, but we didn't vote for all these bureaus either. How would that affect that? And yeah.
So ultimately, you're probably going to be able to shut down some, but not all. I mean, these things exist for a reason, and they're going to take acts of Congress to get rid of, realistically. Some of them are probably still needed, right? But they need oversight. It's Congress's job to provide oversight. But because the executive branch and all these bureaus have grown rapidly and Congress hasn't grown, they just can't keep up with the workload. And so the reality is most of the bureaucrats don't want the responsibility they have. They want Congress to write laws and tell them what to do, right? And they're forced to make these decisions sometimes, and then they'll back up their decision because if they make a decision and somebody in the political realm doesn't run it like it, they'll be attacked and for political reasons. My famous story history, Lyndon Johnson did that to this guy. I cannot remember. I think it was Eli White. He was a civil service guy. He basically outed him as a communist. This is before the full McCarthy era stuff. And, he wasn't. He was a very good civil servant, but because he was in LBJ's way and he made a decision that LBJ didn't like, he took him out. And you got to think, I went to a meet and greet for senators running for Virginia, and I won't say which one did this because I don't want any backlash. But he was a former worked in the government doing something, and he told me a story where he basically blackmailed a civil servant and a representative because of the choices that they backed them into making, right? And they were doing what they thought they were supposed to do based on the law, but now this guy's basically threatening that if they don't now get this guy to vote a different way or do a different thing, he's gonna try to, bring a legal suit against him. And it's like, it shouldn't work that way. These people don't want this, and it's because the people in Congress don't write the rules right. And it makes it harder for the bureaucracy to actually function. Because Congress is small, it makes it hard for them to oversee the bureaucracy, because I think the bureaucracy would be smaller if you had proper management. You wouldn't need so many people. There's a whole bunch of people on your floor that aren't doing anything, right? They can be cleaned up, right? And if you create, Elon and Trump, there's a little bit of truth to this. There's some inefficiency here. Like, we should recognize that and fix it without burning it all down. Like, that's the big thing. Don't burn something down, trim it, right? Like, prune the branches so it can flourish.
All right, so we spoke off. Go ahead, Joey.
Yeah, I was just going to say on that, Jonah Goldberg has given this good analogy, right, where it's the Chesterton fence, right? What somebody needs to tell Elon is, listen, we're with you on eliminating a lot of government programs and government waste, but before you eliminate something, you need to be able to explain why it's there and why it's no longer needed. If you can't do that, you're not a government reformer. You're an arsonist, right? We need reform. And like I said, I'm all for getting rid of the Department of Education, but I don't know that the president can do that. I kind of think Congress has to do something, but we'll see.
Yeah. Well, look, all presidents do this, some more than other, and Trump seems to be pushing it more than other at the moment. But I would do the same thing. If I want to get rid of something, I try to push it and then let the courts decide, right? As opposed to try to wait for its legality. Nah. If I think something needs to go with the understanding that the courts may override it.
See, but that's putting too much pressure on the courts. Okay, and we keep doing that over and over again. If we keep on settling things to the courts, people are not going to be happy. The system is set up to go through Congress, and if you're not using the system properly, you're going to break the system. And ultimately, that's what we're doing. And that's my biggest thing. I was just on my no cap space or my Uncap the House space before we got this, and we were just talking about this. Hamilton, the play. Have you guys seen that?
No.
Like the Lin-Manuel thing. Seen that at all?
Yeah.
No, not okay. So it is like, in my opinion, it's one of the greatest things ever written. It's fantastic. All right. I am not a Hamilton fan per se. I'm a Madison guy, right? Hamilton was a Federalist. Madison was a Republican. Okay. There's a difference. Hamilton believed in the courts and executive power, and Madison believed in Congress and state legislatures. Okay. That is the difference. All right. But we have always been these things. We've always been that way from the founding, and the Hamilton Broadway tells that story so good. It tells the Federalist story. And that's the biggest problem we have in this country is we don't know how the other half of the story goes. The other half of the story goes through Congress. Okay, it's the state legislature.
But hold on, let me cut you off real quick. This is good. But that's the problem we've been having the last 20 years. Congress seems impotent. They don't do anything anymore.
But people don't think they're supposed to do anything. They're happy with it going to the courts. They're happy as long as or they're happy voting for the president. It's just easier that way. They get to abdicate the responsibility to somebody else, and that person promises that they're going to do something. And if that person does something wrong, the courts will stop them. But it's like you keep doing that over and over again, and nobody's writing any laws. What is the courts basing it off of at some point, right? Like there has to be laws written. Things have to be done through Congress. The president can't do everything by executive order. If you do that, it's not a republic anymore. It's
All right,
just
so
not. It's an
okay,
aristocracy.
so then
It's an oligarchy.
so the natural question then would be, how do we light a fire under Congress?
I don't know. Like, I've been trying real hard. I have. I wish I had the answer. I really do. I mean, I've tried to write. I swear, if you put me and Lin-Manuel in a room together, we could write the Madisonian version of Hamilton. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's all people need to learn about representation and how it affects their lives and how it can make their lives better and their lives safer and their children's lives safer. I think that's all it really would take. You talked about earlier parents getting involved, and I was like, look, they got to get involved in the right area. But this is the thing that they should care about. This is their children's future, man. It's representation. Every big fight in government centers around representation. The 3/5 compromise was about representation. Slavery was about representation. The Civil War was about representation, right? Like, these things happen over and over again, and it's always the same fight.
Well, you could argue the open borders, right, was about representation. Flying people into strategic places for representation. So it goes back.
I don't have any evidence of that, but I believe that could be true.
Yeah. Well, neither do I, but it could be true. Go ahead, Joe.
So from a former jurist on the Supreme Court, Antonin Scalia, when he was describing his reason for why he voted against Obergefell and gay marriage, he said something to the effect of, I don't care necessarily about who gets married or what marriage is, but I care very much about who governs me, right? Is it the lawmakers, or is it, this group that I'm a part of, right, of 9 justices on the Supreme Court? And the founders, and I think Scalia rightly thinks it should be the legislators, like people who get elected by the people. And one of the things is, obviously the majority of the court wasn't with Scalia, but one of the things that's actually kind of interesting about right now is that because of the conservative legal movement, we now have a court which is kind of saying that. We haven't had a Congress respond yet, but from getting rid of their decision on Chevron to a whole bunch of things, they haven't, including the abortion one, they haven't actually ruled like the activist judges of a generation ago about one side of the issue or another. They've said, basically, this wasn't our jurisdiction. This wasn't like Congress, do something. And I think what you're doing is kind of like pushing for, let's have a Congress that does something. So that
but
kind of goes
you
into
make a great point.
Go ahead.
You make a great point. And I'm just sad that you thought of it before me, right? Like, it's so brilliant. Look, the Supreme Court has been fantastic recently. I think Judge Gorsuch might be one of the best Supreme Court judges we'll ever have. Like, in legendary, right? Like, reading his dissents or his briefs are just great. And to the point, that's what he's been saying, right? When it comes to Chevron, he's saying, Congress, do your job. They've all been saying, Congress, do your job. Everywhere you look, the people that know the most about government and politics are saying, Congress, do your job. And a lot of people, they're not happy about Trump, right? And I'm not a Trump supporter, right? But the reality is we got Judge Gorsuch with Trump, and I'm not going to not like the guy just because Trump supported him, which some people seem to think that that's what you do. But it's like, he's doing a good job. The court's doing a good job, and they're telling Congress to do their job. And at some point, I think they're going to listen.
Okay, so that being said, right, we're talking about trying to light a fire under Congress. Because look, even though I would push to let the courts decide, it's based on that premise that Congress hasn't been doing anything. If they do their job, then yes, each of the branches would have their equal say. We spoke in the green room or off the air about term limits. Would that apply in your new understanding? Like, how would you incorporate that, if at all? Why and why not?
So, uncapping the House, I think it diminishes the need for term limits because it expands the body, it makes the districts more competitive, it lowers the amount of money it's going to take to get into office, which means it's going to be harder to entrench your power, okay? I think that is good. I think that's how Madison saw it, and that's would be his opinion. However, I wouldn't be opposed to term limits in the House still. Okay. And I would say that the Senate should have no term limits. I think there is value in having like constant power in a body, right? The presidency is going to turn over every, 4 to 8 years. The House is going to turn over, and what I would do is 12 years, right? You win 6 elections. God, that's a lot of work. Why would you want to do more than 6 elections anyways? Get yourself out of there. Go home. Spend some time with your family. Remember, the purpose of life is not to be in the House of Representatives, okay? And, and then you have the Senate that's there for life, right? And you've got this generational power, okay? You take in all aspects. And it's funny, one of those, I think it was Sapiens that I was reading, or maybe it was Abundance. I can't remember. I read them too close together. But it talks about how in the science world, there's a stagnation of ideas in scientific America or tech America because they just weren't listening to the younger people, right? Like they would relegate them out of the way. And I think that's kind of what's happened in government is like you have to bide your time to get a say, and you have to work your way up the ladder. And I think that if you put the term limit to 12 in the House and you're focusing, you go, this is for this type of person, right? In this part of their life. If you want to be if you want a career, you go to you want to be long-term, you go to the Senate. If you're looking to solve a problem in your district or in the country, you go here for a temporary amount of time. And then you have the president there, right? And you've got this generational gap of power, younger, older, wisdom, ambition, put all these things together and you get something great.
Yeah, it's I like this conversation. I'm not, Joey's a political pundit here. I lean more on religion and stuff, but I like this because
well, so speaking of that, and I thought about this earlier, I forgot to say it. So I was reading this great book on the history of Britain, and the one thing that I recognized is how much Christianity played a factor, and how much Christianity wanted people to read, right? And how Britain is the first real representative government, right? Our representative government comes from theirs, and all of the issues that they had, anytime they had a big issue, they always gave more representation out. Right? This happened in different stages, and it finally happened with us, right? And Christianity seems to flourish in representative governments, right? How many Christians are in China in an absolute style of government? Not a lot, right? There's a lot of Christians in America, right? Because we have freedom of religion, right? Like we have freedom to express ourselves. Representative government gives us this ability, and I'm a Christian myself, and I look at my journey as a Christian, my mission is to bring more people to Christ. And the way I look at it, representative government helps me do that. So my job is to support representative government so I can be a good Christian and I can bring more people to Christ.
Amen for that. Go ahead, Joey.
On that topic, so I'm working at an article right now on Russia's kind of Christian nationalism, right? Because one of the things is, and people will see, like the Orthodox Church in Russia has a very close relationship with the Kremlin, and it's kind of like what Christian nationalists here talk about, and yet the actual religiosity of Russians is virtually non-existent. Most Russians don't go to church. Obviously, there's a century of atheist government, whatever. But when you look at America, you look at the fact that yes, we've had a separation of church and state. The fact of all the missions that have flown from here, right? All of the ways the gospel has been proclaimed and, different things established around the world. And the fact that of all industrialized countries, right? Like we are by far the most religious, right? Like we don't need, like, in other words, we need, yes, representation, right? We need to be invested in the political project. But like this idea that we need somehow, one sect of Christianity or the other to have, a hand in power is like, no, like America's strength, the strength of our church has been the fact that the church is free here.
Well, because the church can be in control, right? Like the moment that like it's paired with the government, now you risk the government taking over your church or manipulating your church. And we've seen that in history and different in different ways, right? And again, that's why representative government, in my opinion, although I don't know if there's any statistics that back this up, but like in my opinion, I think representative government is good for Christianity, and I think that the freedom that is allowed is important in allowing the church to be the church, and God's word to be God's word, as opposed to God's word through the government, like I don't think anybody wants that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a uprising of people who may want that. Let me ask you one last question, because we got to wrap up here. I got kids they're in bed, but I got to get to bed myself. You spoke about the Senate not having term limits, and obviously now we have 2 senators per state. Would you increase the senators? Let's say perhaps 4. It still gives it equal balance, but you divide perhaps the Senate and increase the Senate as well?
Maybe. So what I'll say is I am focused on uncapping the House of Representatives. Okay. I come from the people. I belong. If I was going to be involved in government, I would fall into the place where I would go to my representative. I would not go to my senator. And so I try to focus on what I know. I do think that there'll come a time where that will be something that we need to talk about. And I've mentioned before, I think repealing the 17th Amendment would be good. We move it back to the state legislatures. We need to there needs to be some reforms other than outside the House. And I'd be willing to listen about expanding the Senate. But I think based on the Constitution, it's the House we have to focus on expanding. Like once we do that, then we can talk about the other stuff. Okay.
And my last question is, if somebody wanted to join your movement or learn more about it, is there a subgroup on Twitter, on X, on Facebook where they can just mingle and learn and network?
Yes, there is. Thank you so much for asking. So as I mentioned before, you can go to nocapfund.org or y435.com. You can read about representation. You can read about why we need to uncap the House. You can make a donation if you want to support us. You can get on our mailing list. And then on Monday nights at 8:00 on X, we host a space. It's under the at Uncap the House Twitter handle. Every Monday night at 8:00, it's me, Walter, and we're just kind of chatting about stuff. And we are uncapping the House, how we do it.
I don't know where you're at time zone wise, but Joey and I are in 2 different time zones. So 8:00, what time zone?
So 8:00 Eastern. I always forget about the time zone thing. Thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate that. Yeah.
No problem.
Yeah. So it's 8:00 Eastern.
That's my Twitter handle there. Give me a follow and I'll follow you guys back and continue to spread the love. Look, this was an interesting conversation. It's not my strength of field, but I really enjoyed it. And I could see the arguments you're making that we do, when, for example, I'm at a church, I just got here, but I'm already asking for an associate, right? Because you want more people to help minister to the people. And so the more pastors you can have on staff, the better for the people. At least that's how I see it. So, Joey, dismiss us.
Yeah. So one of the things that I appreciate about this conversation, and I think younger voters need to take this to heart, is I have my issues with President Trump, right? I make those clear, right? I'm a conservative, but I think he's got his issues. But I think too much of our politics is about for or against this guy or for or against this. But what you're doing, on the left, right, what you've mentioned with Klein's book, Abundance, right, with, I always mispronounce his name, but Pathakukis on the right, right? What these people are doing is they're doing something different. Rather than just saying what they're against or what you're against, you're saying, no, here's what we're for. We're for representative government. And I feel like that's a better way to engage. So I appreciate it. Any way I can help forward the project, I'd be happy to do it. Thanks for coming on. Maybe we'll have to have you back sometime. But
yes, I second that. Until next time on the Gio and Joey Show, Jeff, thank you very much and be blessed. Hey, stay on while it goes black real quick.